So which armies are reigning supreme in Warhammer 40k, and which have been left by the wayside in the current edition of the game? Let's talk about what's looking strong and what really isn't. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look at the game overall and which armies are doing best and worst after all the big updates in Arcs of Omen. We talked about a few early tournament stats last week, but today I thought we'd revisit things now there's a bunch more data and talk about who seems to be on top in terms of winning events and winning percentages in games in general. A fair bit of the armies that are doing well or badly were as I predict, though there were a few surprises. For the numbers used in this video, I reached out to a relatively new Warhammer YouTube channel called Den of Fools, who I'd noticed had posted a few rather interesting 40k stats breakdowns over the past few weeks. In particular, I quite like their format where they just go through the week's tournament data, look at which armies seem to be doing better or worse, and a few little insights as to the numbers. Thoroughly recommend checking them out. I'll link their channel down in the video description below. They very kindly said that I was okay to take a look at their numbers and talk over them in a video, so a massive thank you to you guys for that. I do feel that it's perhaps a particularly interesting in 40k stats while people are trying to figure out exactly what armies are doing well or badly in the new season, with all the changes that have happened but not much data. One thing that I think is actually quite useful in their numbers is they include the data for both small and big tournaments, so it's a bit of a bigger sample size for a lot of different games, and helps iron out a bit of the randomness you might see week on week, as if you put too much store in any one week's data, then you can get some weird results. In any case, thoroughly recommend checking them out if you want to see some 40k numbers. Getting into this video, there's a few different ways to look at who's winning in Warhammer 40k. Probably my favourite metrics are the tournament win rate, for literally which armies are winning more games against others, and then top event placings, which more shows the armies that you need to beat on the top tables, and perhaps ones that do a little bit better in the hands of a very experienced player, as opposed to an army that does kind of well regardless. I'd say win rate's probably the single most helpful, as the top event placings can be a bit skewed by how many people choose to play the army, though admittedly that in itself is a bit indicative. If a fairly niche army suddenly becomes played massively, it's often because they're kind of strong. Let's talk through win rates first, and then which armies actually seem to be doing well, winning or placing highly at events. First up, for some numbers on faction win rates. This is based on all tournaments, small and large, throughout Arcs of Omen, as per the Den of Fools stats. I basically just combine the numbers of the 2 of the weeks that are relevant for them, and it is a combination of all tournaments, small or large. It does mean that you'll get a fair few more people playing with slightly more casual lists, but to be honest, that's a bit more relevant to most players in Warhammer 40k, as I'm sure the vast majority of people watching this aren't going to be people who've won multiple grand tournaments or things. The advantage of that, though, is that there's really quite a lot of data for it. All the armies besides Harlequins and Inari that are featured here have over 60 players, so that's quite a lot to work with. Though even combining all the tournament events, there's still a fair few armies that are just not being played very much whatsoever. 4 Space Marine sub-factions, including Deathwatch, White Scars, Raven Guard and Imperial Fist, who all, as well as having some fairly bad win rates, just didn't really have the numbers to say reliably one way or the other how good they are. And these armies are looking pretty overshadowed compared with the other Space Marine chapters right now. I feel like Deathwatch is usually an army that has some good potential. They can combine the new cheaper Space Marine units in all sorts of interesting ways in their OBSEC kill teams in the troop section, but they did lose out quite big in a few ways in the Space Marine updates, things like their basic veterans being priced massively higher than say Stern Guard veterans, and their combat doctrine system actually kind of gets in the way of the Space Marine doctrine update, so that was arguably one big buff that the Deathwatch missed out on. Arguably though, Deathwatch might be one of the weaker armies in Warhammer 40k right now, a sub 40% win rate, and very few players choosing to run them right now. I guess for the other chapters, they're still just a bit overshadowed by the various other Space Marine options. White Scars have got some serious competition for melee Space Marines, and Raven Guard and Imperial Fists don't really surprise me too much being down here. They were the ones that were struggling more compared with the rest of the chapters, and things haven't really improved for their codex specifically any more than the other books. Still though, with low numbers, 1 or 2 people doing well with them could turn them around quite a bit in terms of their army win rates, so maybe not worth drawing too much inference here. Moving on though, for the armies that we do have some reasonable numbers for, here's the lowest bracket with armies with a win rate of 40 to 44%. Here it seems that we've got the Ultramarines, the Blood Angels, the Thousand Sons and the Drukhari. Obviously with Space Marines you can either debate whether or not they're one big faction or multiple small ones, but if you take the Ultramarines individually, they don't seem to be doing particularly well. I'm kind of surprised to see them still pretty much at the bottom of the pile. I feel like they do have at least some abilities that work pretty well with some of the boosted units, say for example moving and shooting in their tactical doctrine with heavy weapons. That works okay with a bunch of free multi-melters. I feel like Ultramarines might often have a little bit of a dilution effect from newer players, and potentially Space Marines in general might be having a bit of a draw for armies to play, say, proxy Iron Hands, even if they have painted their armies different ways. Some of the more competitive players might choose to do that, I guess. I'd say out of these four, the biggest surprise to me to find down here is the Blood Angels. They've had some pretty notable success at tournaments recently, already having won one grand tournament in Arcs of Omen, plus of course taking down the Las Vegas Open, though admittedly that was in the Nephilim meta where they had Armour of Contempt, which is really quite a big deal on all of their Sanguinary Guard. Despite that one Arcs of Omen tournament win though, it really does seem that they just haven't been doing that well, both in terms of grand tournaments and in smaller ones. I think they had something like a 30% win rate this week. My guess is that this might just be a bit of teething issues as Blood Angels players adapt to slightly different armies. I think you certainly could argue that without Armour of Contempt, Sanguinary Guard have got weaker overall, even with a bunch of free Inferno pistols. I'd guess that Blood Angels will probably improve from this sort of standing as we get more data in, but I have to admit it's not looking at an amazing start for the Sons of Sanguinius. Otherwise, much less surprised to see down here are the Thousand Sons, 43% win rate with 85 people playing them. It did feel like they were some of the biggest losers of the Arcs of Omen change, losing the Armour of Contempt but getting points buffs to various units that aren't exactly the core of their battle line. I feel like the most useful thing that they got was some slightly cheaper spawn. A lot of the rest was just a little bit underwhelming. Still though, 43% isn't terrible, it's not like they're completely out the running, but it does feel like they're on the lower end of the 40k power spectrum. Finally, and towards the top of the lower tier bracket are the Drukhari. They had a 44% win rate and 63 players. I'd say Arcs of Omen didn't really change things massively for them, gave them some slightly cheaper witches but slightly more expensive racks. I also feel that their detachment changes didn't really help them too much, getting the Arcs of Omen 1 plus 1 allied patrol rather than their triple patrol thing that they had going before. Still though, even if they're making bottom tier in this, 44% or even 41% isn't exactly the most terrible win rate in the world. In the previous season we had Space Marines and AdMech in general on something like 37, so it's a bit better than there. Broadly speaking, not the worst in terms of armies being somewhat balanced against each other, I suppose. Moving on, we've got the lower middle bracket, everything from 45% to 49%, all armies that look like they have a pretty reasonable chance of doing okay in big events and things, but perhaps not the most standout armies in the game at the moment. 45% or above is what generally Games Workshop tend to consider as balanced enough to be okay, and it appears like the vast majority of armies in the game are in this bracket, which is probably a good thing for 40k overall. Here we've got Standard Space Marines combining all supplements, plus Chaos Space Marines both on 46%, they're there with Tyranids. Then on 47 we have Sisters, Grey Knights, Death Guard, Admech, Space Wolves and Tau Empire. Black Templars and Necrons very slightly ahead on 48, and Imperial Knights at the top of this bracket at 49%. Going through those individually, the Space Marine numbers are combined including the divergent chapters, kind of depends on how you want to subclassify them, so I thought we'd talk through the individual numbers for the books as well. As well as Black Templars and Space Wolves, the Salamanders are also in this sort of bracket as well at 47%, though as we'll mention, a couple of the other chapters are significantly better. It seems that overall though, despite all the free war gear and massive points decreases, it does seem that Space Marines in general aren't massively stand out or being oppressive to anyone, it's more just a couple of chapters that are having some good success. Salamanders, Black Templars and Space Wolves I think all had good things come out of the updates though. Salamanders get on very well with free or cheaper multi-melters. Space Wolves got some great points cuts, plus a bunch of nice free Wolfguard pack leaders with lots of boasted gear. And Black Templars I think became a bit more relevant with their 5+ invul saves being pretty nice. Now Armour of Contempt is gone and they're actually likely to trigger them. Otherwise, Tyranids are on the lower end of this, but don't seem to be completely out of the running. I feel like perhaps the points nerfs that Games Workshop gave them were just a little bit of an overcompensation, but it does appear that they've not been utterly and completely wrecked by them. Weaker than average, but not one of the very weakest factions in the game. Sisters definitely have been brought down a bit to 47%, though still seem to be played quite a bit. Grey Knights again are kind of low middling, maybe not anything massively exciting. I feel like most of their changes were kind of side grades at best, though it does look like someone's managed to win a grand tournament with them, so they certainly can punch up a bit. Death Guard are actually doing a bit better than I might have expected, at least by this early data. 47% is kind of where they were before. I guess the points cuts have been compensating a fair bit for their durability going down. Tau Empire were quite solid last season, but they did take some big hits to things like Crisis Suits and Sunshark Bombers. Maybe not too surprised to see the edge taken off them a bit, but again they seem to be a faction that does okay in big tournaments. As before, I feel like their win rate's still going to be at least kind of mediocre, but perhaps an army that seems to be a bit overrepresented on the top tables, with the strongest players around being able to run them a bit better than some others. Kinda good to see Necrons in a fairly healthy place at 48%, they're pretty much mid-tier. I feel like Games Workshop did give them quite a nice update with that one, making them a bit less oppressive on objectives, but making a bunch of their units just that bit more efficient with points cuts. Finally, Imperial Knights are perhaps just a little bit lower down the rankings on these early takes than I might have expected. Still seem to be doing kind of fine, but if anything, just a little bit worse than they were in the last season. I guess having big numbers of players for armies like Guard, Votan, and Demons aren't particularly good for them. All of those armies can counter the Knights at least fairly well. Moving onward, we come to the upper middle bracket with armies that are 50% win rates or a bit above. Here on 50%, we've got the Guard, the Craftworld Eldar, and the Leagues of Votan. On 52, we've got Genestealer Cults and Chaos Knights. On 53, we've got Harlequins defying their nerfs, Orcs and Dark Angels. And on 54, we've got Adeptus Custodes, who, unless you lump all the Space Marine codexes together, are the most played faction with a big 231 players. For the Guard, I honestly was expecting them to be doing a little bit better than this. I thought they'd be one of the strongest armies in the game, but it really seems that even with mass Rosses and Kazakan damage dealing, they're not dominating the meta, but have just solid performance. I guess a lot of their troops units aren't the hardest to remove from objectives and things, even if they do have some pretty fearsome damage output, and some rather nice secondaries that improved a bit. Craftworld seem to be doing pretty nicely, with really quite a big player rate as well. Again, I felt maybe Arcs of Omen was a bit of a side grade for them. They did have some units go down like the Shroud Runners, but some squads like Swooping Hawks went up by quite a bit. Seems like they're performing fairly solidly at the moment though. Leagues of Votan got nerfs, and it seems that shunted them a bit more closer to the mid-tier. Seems to be a good amount of people playing them. Lots of lists seem to be heavily reliant on those Hernkin bikes now that troops became mandatory, and a lot of the rest of the codex went up in points, but they didn't despite being perhaps the best unit. I'm not surprised to see Genestealer Cults climbing up the rankings a bit. They got a bunch of helpful changes, particularly things like some cheaper characters. Still not played very much as they're quite a niche faction, but it does seem like they're a lot more capable of making things work now. Chaos Knights have had really quite a big boost. In the previous season, they were solidly behind their Imperial counterparts. I feel like perhaps the main thing that might be driving that is improved secondary objectives. One of theirs got nicely better, and the extra slots for Lords of War and things could be helpful for your choice of demonic favours. Harlequins are very low played at only 45 players, though to be fair to them, that was kind of similar to how they were in Nephilim. They were very low played despite winning lots of tournaments. I guess the exact numbers might be a bit less reliable for them as a result, but it seems on the face of it they're still doing fine despite worse invul saves. I did suspect that they'd be a bit more mid-tier, but not one of the weakest armies in the game with their mad mobility. Orcs seem to be doing particularly well at the moment. Lots of people seem to be running various incarnations of Dangerous Goths melee. There's quite a lot of viable units for them, and in particular feel like the flavour of the month units might be the regular Nob squad with Power Claws. Now Games Workshop cut the cost for them. They managed to make it all the way to the LVO final in fairly big numbers, and that was before they reduced the cost on the Power Claws. Dark Angels were another army that I really wasn't too surprised to see ranking very, very highly. Between them and Iron Hands, they were just some of the Marines that won the most from the updates. Thunderhammer and Stormshield Terminators are crazy efficient, and they're best in Deathwing. All game Devastator Doctrine means super fast Raven Wing the entire game long, and a bunch of their core and non-core options also got decently cheaper, like multi-melter attack bikes or Storm Speeder Thunderstrikes. Lastly, in this bracket, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, who are on a big 54% win rate, definitely one of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k at the moment. Their stratagems are very powerful, now you can field them all game long. Wardens and Terminators are now credible options again, now they get objectives secured once more. They've got slightly cheaper Sisters of Silence, and having a lot more Marines running around in the meta is great for them. Generally, they tend to counter Space Marines pretty well with all their damage too. I actually do kind of wonder whether the win rate numbers for Adeptus Custodes might be a bit diluted as well. In terms of easy Warhammer 40k armies to start, Custodes are perhaps the single easiest. You don't need that many models to put on the board, and there's recently been an enormous Christmas Battle Force box that's tempted a lot of people into starting the faction. It's probably not the be-all and end-all, but I wouldn't be surprised if that weren't the case, then the win rate might be a percentage point or two higher. In any case, I think they're just about unquestionably one of the top armies, and also one of the ones you're most likely to run into. Finally though, winning it out on raw win percentage are the armies that had 55% win rate or higher. And here we've got three armies: Chaos Demons, Iron Hands, and Inari. The Chaos Demons had 55% and had really quite a big player representation with a big 163 of them. That is really enormous for a faction like Demons, they're just not that commonly played. I think it might be a combination of them being quite good last season as well with a fairly recent codex update, plus also looking very strong now. Their flamers got worse, but it still looks like they're a perfectly viable unit and people are using them. And on top of that, they got a whole swathe of points cuts throughout the codex as well, with things like Fleshhounds going down to 15 points or Fiends being significantly cheaper. Overall, it just seems like they're an army with a whole ton of raw strength, and plus counter some factions pretty hard. Things like their Demon Invul saves really ruin armies that rely on loads of high AP to deal their damage. Most of their good units are kind of spectacularly fast and aren't too hard to overrun a gun line with or engage enemies in combat with their deep strike shenanigans. Otherwise, we've got Iron Hands. Again, I'm really not surprised to see these guys up here. I think no one really would have been after the Devastator doctrine changed. Iron Hands were kind of the reason that Games Workshop altered doctrines in the way that they did, so that you only get one turn of Devastator, and now it's back, they're massively strong again. Their infantry with heavy weapons get to move and ignore the heavy weapon penalty. They reroll ones to hit with those guns all game long, as well as getting the extra AP, plus just in general they're one of the chapters with some of the best support options around. Nice stratagems including a 5+ feel no pain, good psychic powers to help out their vehicles, and a fairly terrifying character Contemptor Dreadnought that they can field with a whole bunch of Volkite shots buffed up. I feel like it's definitely them and Dark Angels who are taking the top spots for the Space Marines at the moment. They seem to be the most competitive ways to run the faction. Finally, we have the mixed Eldar death cult that is the Inari. On paper, in terms of win rate, it does seem that they win out from these numbers. They've got 57%, higher than any other one army, though they do only have a very tiny sample size of only 36 players, so it might be a bit less a reliable figure than some. I feel like them and Harlequins might be a bit of an element of tending to be run by more competitive players, more game focused, so their more competitive lists probably don't have that much dilution. Still though, even if that is a thing, it still seems that they're unquestionably strong. The Incarn usually sits at the centre of each list with the psychic powers and a big sword that ignores invul saves and bounces around the table when units die. And then there's a lot of good support for various scary Eldar melee units, and you can mix in a few Harlequins or some Drukhari units to bring out some extra strength from death. Particularly Harlequin troops, when they're layered with the Inari buffs, can be incredibly scary in melee, and they can always use the other good craft world options as well. Things like small units of Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions with Exarch upgrades tend to be popular. So overall, putting it all together, by these win rates at least, 40k doesn't seem to be in too terrible a place balance-wise, only a few armies being outside Games Workshop's usual target of 45 to 55%. From these numbers, armies like Inari, Iron Hands and Chaos Demons, Custodians, Orcs and Dark Angels all look particularly threatening, and on the weaker end of the spectrum, armies like Thousand Sons, Drukhari and Blood Angels seem to be struggling more than most. Broadly though, I'd rate this as fairly positive news for the win rate. The majority of armies can compete at least at some level, though of course it still looks like some have a better chance of winning than others. Otherwise, perhaps one of the other main ways to look at how well armies are doing in Warhammer 40k is which armies actually tend to be placing high at events. Sometimes an army could have quite a low win percentage, but get more first place podium places than you might expect, for example. Maybe an army that's not that easy to play when you first go to it, but when you've mastered it, it gets quite strong. Just for a very rough and ready check of which armies tend to be doing well at tournaments these days, I thought we'd look at the same sample, but then just take a look at which armies have either won a small tournament of less than 20 players, or placed in the top 3 of bigger events with 20 or more players, just for a bit of a cross-section of the armies that seem to actually be achieving these top places. I think it's a fairly helpful selection tool, as any list that I've got here have had to win far more than they've lost, and as there haven't been an enormous amount of big 5-round huge tournaments so far, it might be quite helpful in the meantime. It probably will give a good idea of the armies that you need to beat to actually take top places if you want to win a tournament of 40k, and it will be skewed a bit by the numbers of people playing each faction, so the most played factions are going to have a higher rate here. Going through the list from this perspective, the ones that didn't get all that many high placings are Ultramarines, Death Guard, Genestealer Cult, Admech, Thousand Sons, Drukhari, the other Codex Space Marine chapters, and Deathwatch. Quite a lot of overlap between the lists here. Thousand Sons, Drukhari, Deathwatch, and Ultramarines all doing fairly badly. Genestealer Cult perhaps being a bit lower than their win percentage here, though I guess they aren't the most popular played army in the game. For lower middle type armies in this metric, we've got Grey Knights, Blood Angels and Salamanders and Inari all with 6, Harlequins and Black Templars with 7, and then Adeptus Sororitas, Imperial Knights, Necrons and Space Wolves making up the top of this section. Certainly not really all that much good news for Grey Knights and Blood Angels here. I would have expected them to be a bit higher as per the number of players that they had. And actually the numbers I think are kind of impressive for Harlequins and Inari, as they had very low player rates indeed, so 7 and 6 wins here are quite impressive. Otherwise, getting on to the upper middle section, we've got Chaos Space Marines, Orcs, Chaos Knights, Tyranids, Tau Empire, Leagues of Votann, and Iron Hands. I feel like most of those kind of make sense for the win rates plus the numbers of people playing. Maybe Orcs are a little bit lower here than I might have expected, and Tyranids perhaps a little bit higher. For the amount of people running Iron Hands as well, they're pretty overrepresented with 15. Out of any of these armies, Iron Hands had far fewer players than these 7, so it does speak volumes that they placed higher in more events than the rest of them, despite having fewer players. Then we get to the very top set, 16 or more high placing in these tournaments. Here we've got Dark Angels on 16, Craft Worlds on 17, Guard on 18, Chaos Demons on 20, Custodies on 27, and if you combined all the various Codex style Space Marines, including Iron Hands, Ultramarines, Salamanders, and friends, then you'd get 28. For the numbers here, I'd say that Dark Angels are perhaps looking more impressive than Craft Worlds, as Craft Worlds had quite a lot more players than Dark Angels, and the same goes for Imperial Guard. Chaos Demons and Custodies I think are relatively well weighted to how many people were playing them. I'd say this does actually reflect the win rate list really quite well. Chaos Demons did win fewer events, but there were fewer people playing them in general. I'm not necessarily sure how much sense it really makes to lump all the Codex Space Marine supplements together. Over half of that number is being carried by Iron Hands, who were on 15 high placings, and Space Marines in general are a very popular faction if you lump them all together. In general, I would say that as with the win rates, the vast majority of the actual wins of the Space Marine chapters are generally carried by the Dark Angels and the Iron Hands. This is the complete high placings list all put together if you're interested. Again, for the most part, I would say that this tallies fairly well with the win rates. Custodies and Chaos Demons arguably lead the way. I'd say that the Marines are carried a bit by the Iron Hands, with good showings for Eldar, Guard, and Dark Angels as well. Harlequins and Inari are quite impressive as well, considering the low player numbers. Quite nice to see that just about every army in the game is at least having some tournament success at some level, though again, obviously a bit of a gap between the top armies and the bottom ones. Finally, here are just the two lists next to each other if you want to do a bit of a comparison. Based on both the win rates and the high placings, I'd probably rate the top armies in Warhammer 40k at the moment to be Custodies, Iron Hands, Demons, Dark Angels, and Inari, but really quite a lot of other contenders fairly hot on their heels: Craft Worlds, Guard, Tau, Orcs, Leagues of Votan, Genestealer Cults, Harlequins, and both Chaos and Imperial Knights all seem to be challenging. On the flip side of the list, at least by this data, Deathwatch, Thousand Suns, Blood Angels, and Drukhari all seem to have the biggest issues in the game right now, scoring pretty low on both lists, and there's a fair few others that rank pretty underwhelming on both of them. Deathguard, Admech, Chaos Marines, and Grey Knights don't seem to be doing enormously well either, and probably a little bit more lower tier than some. Hopefully we'll check back at some point to see how these numbers are getting on later in the Arcs of Omen season, and at some point I'll probably get round to doing an updated Warhammer 40k army tier list as well, and talk through some of the strengths and weaknesses of the factions at the moment. In any case, let me know what you think of the numbers. Are there any placings for armies here that surprised you, or you think that people just haven't quite figured out yet? As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and if you'd like to check out some top army lists for each one of these factions in Arcs of Omen, I'll leave a link to my big army list overview video down in the video description. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below also. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.